get the notice that, okay, we're going to close, sorry, and blue slips come out, your anxiety will go up. Oh no, I just lost my job, right? That's acute anxiety. That's something that's very real, and it's a response to a real threat, a fear that what is, so to speak, and it's very time limited. Chronic anxiety is the one I want to focus on, though. Chronic anxiety is very different. Chronic anxiety is kind of a response to imagined threat. Something might happen. You don't know it will, but based on your experience from the past, it's triggering something in you, and you think, oh no, that could really happen. And you kind of begin to respond accordingly by what you're thinking that might actually occur. So this is not time limited. I use this term, the worry wart, penny, kind of the fear monger, if you will. And I'll talk a little bit about it, then I'll apply it to the video, if you will. So acute anxiety, the important part about anxiety is often significant within a relationship system. So as you can see from the slide, the square is a male here, and then the circle is often a female, as you do genograms and some of this family system. So here you have a relationship system that's more or less in balance, but then if you get a stressor introduced, an example I'll give is, I have a sister-in-law, she was adopted. My mother-in-law was really big in the pro-life movement. She was keen that way and felt like she should, if you're going to be in that movement, you should also adopt. So she adopted a daughter. So my sister-in-law is a bit younger than my wife. She's about 20 years younger, I guess. But 2 years back, she got married to Nigeria, and he was an immigrant. Things were going well, but cross-cultural issues. And the stressor that was introduced was she got pregnant. So what happens when you get pregnant? I don't know, in your life, what happens, honey, I think I'm pregnant. I could think of 4 very different responses I had in my life for each of those events, but when that comes in, there's initial tension in the relationship a little bit. You kind of love each other and everything's great, but there's tension. What are we going to do about the car? What are we going to do about jobs? What are we going to do about the apartment? Can we afford it? Right? But this was my perspective. My wife's perspective was slightly different. But there's tension. Is this the right time? Right? Is this the right time for that? And my mother would say, it's never a right time. You just have to do it. But there's tension in the relationship, right? Tension in the relationship. But you talk through it, you think through it, you can manage it, and then if everything gets resolved, the anxiety kind of dissipates and balance is restored. That's typical how most of life goes through. Something comes up, you lose your job, you struggle a few months, but you get another job, your spouse kind of supports you in it, and you kind of get through it. If the months go a little longer and you think you should get a job and you don't quite get it, then you get a little edgy and you get depressed and there's more tension in the relationship, how that can go and kind of get ugly. But in time, we typically work those things out and then it moves on pretty well. I'd like to talk with my sister-in-law. Let me show this next slide there. Chronic anxiety is different, though. Chronic anxiety is when you have a stressor that gets introduced, and there's kind of a reactive response in the relationship, but it does not get resolved in a normal way, and the relationships come back to a healthy, positive sort of homeostasis. There's something that happens that leaves a lot of tension in it, so the balance is not fully restored. So my sister-in-law gets pregnant, goes full term, and the baby is not coming, and the doctor said, that's fine, we'll induce. So they induced the child. My first child was born in Bangladesh, remember I said this, and she was 9.5 pounds. For a first child, that was big. It took a lot of work to get her out. We were kind of anxious about all of that, but The next child, we said, well, we're not going to have a child in rural Bangladesh this time. We're going to America. So we did. And we induced the children. And so you're going to begin at 7 in the morning. It's easy from my side to say this. You know, it was different for my wife, but so you induce it, and you know the day goes through, and you have all the drama of the day. But kind of by 4 o'clock, you're more or less done. I mean, again, this is the male's perspective, but the baby's there, the baby's cleaned up. Now you're moving toward breastfeeding, taking photos. I mean, the day's kind of done. So we had 3 of our children. They were all big. My son was like 10, 14 or something. He's enormous, but it moves through. So my sister-in-law, though, so they induce and they start 7 in the morning, but by 4 in the afternoon, there's still not much progress. And then pretty soon it's 8 at night, pretty soon it's 2 in the morning, and now it's 24 hours, right? So this is a completely different situation. And then they measure the child's heartbeat, and the infant is really stressed, and they had to do emergency C-section going into it, a lot of tension, and then the mother as well, her body was really stressed. So for my brother-in-law, the Nigerian, he thought he was going to lose a child and a wife at the same time. So this passed, they had the child, it was in the infant ICU and stuff for a long time. Everything kind of resolved itself, but she just got pregnant again about 3 months back. So how are they doing the pregnancy? Well, you can't work, you got to stay off your feet. You know, there's just real anxiety in the pregnancy. It's completely different. So they're approaching what she eats, what she does, what she doesn't do very differently, because there's this fear that she could die in the pregnancy, and he's going to be left with this one child, orphaned in the midst of it. Chronic anxiety has the sense that something happened in the past, and it's creating a fear in you in such a way that you're overly sensitive or overly reactive to situations that other people would not be as reactive to, if you will. So chronic anxiety has that sense. So what happens then, like in the pregnancy, oh, I'm pregnant. Well, my brother-in-law's response to the second pregnancy is completely different than the first pregnancy. He's doing all the cooking. He's carrying all the groceries. He's doing all the cleaning. Oh, honey, it's not good to use that soap. There's chemicals. Oh, honey, it's not good to use that laundry detergent. There's chemicals. Everything is triggering and what would you say, an overly reactive response. So the reactivity, in a sense, is really magnified in the response. Okay, that's a sign there's some chronic anxiety. If you've had cancer in your family and someone goes in for, say, a breast exam, for some people that's just a common everyday thing, but for other people they would be extremely anxious. If you've had mental illness in your family, certain things will trigger that for you. You'll be afraid. In my family, there's some alcoholism, right? So I called my son last night after the workshop, and we were going to just talk. He's in grad school now, and he's kind of finishing up, and I was just going to see how he's doing. And he's there, and he said, oh, Dad, I'm getting drunk. We're just sitting around. And for a family, when you come out of it, you're like, oh, my word, he didn't mean getting drunk. He wouldn't laugh that way, right? They were just having a beer and then watching sports. But just his language triggered something in me that was really deep, because I grew up in an alcoholic home and knew what kind of violence and stuff was. So as soon as he said, oh, we're getting drunk, did he get the G? Should he be careful? Do I need to step in? Are you get all this. Well, the response coming out of me, if you would take another family, oh, it's grad school, he had a couple of big exams, they just finished, hard week of work, he works for the Army Corps of Engineers, hard week of work, Saturday night they're watching a ball game, having a beer and a burger, you wouldn't think anything of it. But for me, it triggers something different. That's what I'm trying to get at. So in the video we saw last night, I highlighted this a little bit. They started a contemporary worship, but all the while people were referring back to the last time, we were building this new wing of the church. We lost a lot of members. So you get financial things, you get other things. So it triggers for them. The older members got triggered by this, and the newer members didn't even know about it. But the older members had as you look at the video, you think, how can they be so reactive? All they've done is this different worship. Why are they so reactive? But they were reactive. It's because they had a past history, and that history is coming into play. For the newer members, they didn't have this past history. So I think if my daughters get pregnant or something, oh, I'm pregnant, everything's wonderful, but they don't know the risks that you can go through in some of that, right? So I'll talk about it, but that word, why so reactive? Like, how is it so explosive? Why is it being magnified? Well, the response is because there's chronic anxiety, sort of a deep trauma or fear. Something happened in the past, and that's been carried over in a different way. And we'll see that. All right, I'm going to use a couple of extreme examples here. Here's one. We're going to look at a family, and then we're going to come back to this church in Texas I talked about. This is Eugene O'Neill. It's going to be hard, and I'm going to have a lot of words on the page. You're not going to be able to see, but we'll go through it. So, Eugene O'Neill, has anyone read Eugene O'Neill sing any other plays? Oh yeah, it kind of goes back. So many would describe him. He died in the 50s, so it's a little bit old, but he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is really a significant achievement, and many consider him one of probably the greatest American playwright, but if not one of the greatest American writers. But two plays in particular, The Iceman Cometh and The Long Day's Journey into Night, which is a very long play, actually. That one, I've read that, but I haven't seen it staged in any way. So he also, so the Nobel Prize for Literature, Pulitzer Prize, and other things. I want to talk a little bit about Eugene's life and how chronic anxiety kind of plays out in his life. So you're not going to be able to follow this. This is his genogram. Eugene is kind of right in the middle. It's a square, half black on the bottom, half white on the top, and some of the relationship patterns, but his parents and grandparents throughout that. So Eugene came from an Irish family. O'Neill is Irish. His grandfather, his father's father, came to the U.S. in 1856 or so, but in the very same year, he kind of comes to America, drops off his wife and kids, and goes back to Ireland, commits suicide, it's believed. Maybe it was he died, nobody knows exactly, but it seems like he committed suicide, and that comes out on that side. On his mother's side, the grandfather was alcoholic, and that was kind of passed down through that. His father, Eugene's father, was actually an actor himself. He would travel the U.S. By rail car, and he would go to town. He was doing a play called The Count of Monte Cristo. He was the Count, and he was very famous. People knew him all throughout the U.S., and it was a big deal to go see that play. But he's traveling, he's never available, he's never present. Eugene said at one point, I was born in a hotel room, I'll die in one. And that sense of his whole life story. But the father, lots of different relationships. He was in and out of marriages, a lot of extramarital affairs, premarital stuff. Also very alcoholic, but very little to do with his own children. He was on the road, left his children to his wife, basically, in New York, and traveled. On the mother's side, one of the children died. She blamed the second son for the death. The details of it, I forget right at the moment, but she becomes addicted to morphine. So Eugene's life growing up, he had this mother with an opioid addiction. So she was non-functioning, and the father's on the road. He was in a boarding school and got some education that kind of helped him along, if you will. But a little bit about his life. So in this dysfunctional family, he gets married, has a wife and a son, but immediately abandons attempts suicide just a few years after the marriage, contracts tuberculosis, which often goes with alcoholism. In 1918, then he starts to get his life back together. He remarries, but he ignores this set of children as well. He's pretty alcoholic. By about 1928, 29, he's starting to get his life back together again, gets married for the third time, but he doesn't have anything to do with his children. And one of his daughters, she was 18, she marries Charlie Chaplin. Eugene refuses to go to the wedding. Charlie was in his 50s at the time. But here you grow up, you don't have any men in your life, you have abnormal life, you're 18, and you run off and get married to this older man. It's kind of the way she did it. So this is Eugene's life. But the impact of this then on his children. So his firstborn, Eugene Jr., never saw his father until he was 12 years old. First time he met his dad. He was also in a series of marriages and divorces, also alcoholic, and in 1950 committed suicide, cut off. Shane, a second-born child, also cut off from his father, alcoholic, suicidal. And then you have a third child, Eugene III. He dies of neglect as an infant. So when you put it all together, it's pretty easy to pick Eugene Jr. or Shane or any of one of the characters and to say, well, why don't you just get your life together, right? Why don't you just sort of get your life together, pull yourself up by the bootstraps? And we do that with God's grace, and Eugene, to some degree, did that as well. But the yellow just represents the chronic anxiety of dysfunction in the family, of cutoff, of no one present, no parents, no this, unstable relations, fear that someone's going to come into your life and then leave your life. And so as you go into life, you're just not sure. You feel so unsettled in your life. This is that sense of chronic anxiety. It's this deep tension kind of in your soul, and you don't know how it's going to play out in life. So all of us come into life with sort of a sense of chronic anxiety. This is, I hope, an extreme example for this, but every family has different members that seem to bear the brunt of this in a slightly different way. And you could think about maybe siblings that somehow didn't quite function as well as other siblings. And you kind of wonder, you get a family, 3 doctors doing great, PhDs, etc., and then you get one brother living on the street, and you think, how is it that you have 4 kids, they all grew up in the same household, and somehow it plays out in different ways? This is kind of that sense of chronic anxiety. Bowen was really working with schizophrenic families. That's kind of a different issue. Friedman applies it to the church, and that's kind of the direction we'll go into it. So I don't have my manual before me, but if you open your manual to B2, we'll start talking about some of the common triggers of anxiety. Before we go into these, as you're pulling out, any questions or comments on acute anxiety and chronic anxiety? You see the difference? Anyone want to jump in and make a statement or anything about that? The screen moved on me somehow, so I'm just trying to get organized. So it's going to be important to understand chronic anxiety, why the extreme reactivity that we are seeing and some of the stresses. And we'll talk more about it, but it seems like the world feels extremely stressed now. And then the war in Ukraine, you get the pandemic, you get the inflation, you get all this stuff going on, a number of relatives that have died because of the pandemic, other concerns about that. And then the war in Ukraine, it just feels like one more thing that has stepped up into our lives. So we feel like we're kind of an anxious society these days. I mentioned this workbook was developed by Stanky and here what he identifies as the 10 most common triggers of anxiety within congregations. I talked a lot about pregnancy, losing a job, alcoholism in a family, mental illness. That's my side of the family has the alcoholics. It doesn't have mental illness. My wife's side, though, a lot of mental illness. Almost every generation, a lot of mental illness. We just never had it, or physical issues. Some families have a lot of physical difficulties that come out. We didn't have much of that either, though I had a sister who had polio growing up, and she had the braces. She was born in 58, but for some reason she couldn't get the vaccine. Contracted polio, she had it, and then, with the pandemic that came out, her response to getting vaccinated was so different than others, and how she was careful and other things. Well, she had polio growing up, so as soon as a new pandemic came out, she was so much edgier than others, and you can understand some of that history. From the congregational side, let's go through a couple of these things there. What really triggers anxiety within congregations? Well, the first one is money, of course. Do we have enough money? Can we do what we want? And then membership is often related to money, giving money, needing money, not having enough money, or not paying our apportionments to the Presbyterian. You don't call them apportionment, assessments. I forgot what Presbyterians, is it assessments? Yeah, assessments. Oh, the per capita, that's it. Yeah, the apportionment is a Methodist term. I think, is that right? I'm just confused on that. But you know what I mean, the fact that we're not carrying our fair share, we can't keep up. And money often, if you, in a church where you have certain staff, and this is true in workplaces as well, that if you're lacking income and you have to release staff, that's an incredibly anxious time. I know in the pandemic, so many restaurants and others were decreasing staff. It's if you're a manager and you have to go tell someone, I'm sorry, but those are the things that just really increase it. It's not just because you don't have money, but it's the impact of that, particularly in the relationship side of it. Types of worship. I don't understand this side of it exactly. There's something more to it than just types of worship. There's sort of a theological statement that goes with it. There's some deeper understandings that get tied into that. But often you'll see that coming up. I know there's been some tensions in this church. I don't know if I call them tensions, how you would describe it, but the types of worship and moving forward with some of that. Often issues involving anything related to sex or sexuality. We know that, and trying to think through that as churches, as families, and what that looks like exactly with the pastor's leadership style, particularly if you have a pastor that's sort of very directive, authoritarian perhaps, and then you get someone who's much more laissez-faire. Just the shifting in those styles can be really significant. Or old versus new, and changing from the old to the new and what that looks like. Can be a new hymnal. I don't know if you've ever had that. A new book of worship. There's so many hymns, and I said I was brethren, but Be Thou My Vision, one of my favorite hymns. And I used to do mission work in Nepal, hiking around and visiting these remote Christians and stuff, and I would often sing that along the trail. Just wonderful. My singing's not wonderful, that hymn. Our hymnal changed the words in that, and they kind of missed the stress patterns. So not only they were trying to kind of update and become more gender neutral in the wording, but they didn't do a very good job. So it's just so grating to hear it. But you'll get that. Or they'll play the hymn with a modern tune. You think, oh, that other tune is so much better. We get some of that. Certainly structural changes, particularly if you're moving around at the judicatory level, who you relate to, and then how the church is organized, some of that. And then this idea of growth and survival. I think there's always this existential question: will we survive? Who's going to take the leadership after we're gone? Do we have enough young people? What's it going to look like? We're aging. All of those questions come up, but they produce an anxiety in us. That's the thing to highlight. Not that it's an unusual situation, it's a normal situation. If you grow up in farmland, like at least in Illinois farmland, when I was growing up, you almost had a farmhouse every quarter mile on each side of the road, and people would have their 160, 300 acres, little plots of land. They were farmers, a couple of animals. And then, I was born in 62. My life was basically, the farms, the children go off or whatever, the farm sells, another farm buys it up and becomes bigger. And then the house sits there for a while, maybe they rent it out, but then you knock down the house. And so you just see, every quarter mile, that house went down, that house went down. And then pretty soon the farms are, 3,000 acres or whatever, and you have one or two farmers farming the whole thing. So all the others, and it's just, that was the normal transition that took place. So it creates an anxiety if you're a milk farmer and don't have children. I'm trying to let Betsy into the room, but I
got her.
I don't know why she's not jumping in. And the last one here, staff conflicts, transitions. In my work, often it's the music director. It's the funniest thing. Are you the music director? You're the man. I'll give you a couple examples. Let me just give you one example. This is on the side. Are you Tom? Yeah, Tom, we'll pick on you. No. I'll highlight it again, but it's a good time to point. Why do you think relating to the music director would cause conflict in the church? Well, all the other issues you mentioned up there, first of all, money, oh, well, we can't have that. Or types of worship, oh, okay. You go down the list, all of them relate to the music director in one way. Not all of them, but, we'd get more people in this church if we had a better music director. I don't know anything about you, but staff conflict, old versus new, all of it play out. But the interesting thing about a music director is the music director often connects to people in a very personal way. Like you will go to church because you like the music director. And often when you think about the church, sort of the branding of the church, in a way, can often be the music director. I'll try to give this illustration. We do family reunions on my wife's side, sort of once a year at Christmas. Everybody that can kinds to come together and it's sort of a potluck. And her family is, they're all Dutch Reformed and extremely cold, unlike other Presbyterian Reforms. But it's kind of a very cold, distant family. But there's one uncle in there who's a high school biology teacher, coaches the football team, big Christian school in Grand Rapids, and just a wonderful guy. He's the guy out with, the juniors, and they're walking up and down the riverside, picking up, snakes, and, that guy. And he's just so fun. My kids really like him. So they want to go to these reunions, even though they don't know all the great aunts and uncles and stuff, and it's kind of formal, and, it feels a bit stodgy. But, if Uncle Arnie is there, it's just great. So they want to go because of Uncle Arnie. And he makes that ability to connect. And I think often the music director is that one that you like, oh yeah, let's go because he makes that connect. So if you don't do that, I deeply apologize. But doing a mediation at a church in New York, and it was an Episcopal church, and it was new clergy, and this priest, she's kind of middle-aged, had a couple of daughters coming in, and so the church was so happy to get her, right? Young and fresh and energized. And she knows she needs to reach out to younger families. And so she tells the music director, you know, I really want you, when you're leading worship, you know, if we could do something with the children and we could do hand signals, it'll be really cute and really fun. This little light of mine, you know, that sort of stuff. Well, the music director worked in New York City and put on large concerts. He was a professor of music at some university. I forget the full details. Well, that was so beneath him. He was used to having big concerts, big choirs, bringing in the public. That's what he wanted to do. He didn't want to do any of this light of mine, so there was tension. And anyway, they fired him. This new rector fired him. You're questioning my authority, and I forget how it played out. Well, he said, okay, fine, I'll leave the church. He left the church. Well, the church said, we're more about the music than we are about the church. So they went and formed a new church based around the music director. Just said they could have their chorale and other things completely. And they even named it. I mean, you can look it up. But the whole new church, they said, no, this is what we're going to do, and rented space. And that was it. And I tried to do mediation, and they said, no, we left. We don't need mediation. We're not coming back. But it was based on the music director and the way it played out. If any of that applies, I'm deeply sorry I didn't read it. But it's very interesting, but I just want to highlight that it's often the face of the church people really connect. And often then, you know, the youth, you lead the youth, so part of that program, part of other programs. I don't know how it works. It's interesting that way. So I mentioned it. And then, of course, internal or external focus. How much do we join together in a mission to move outside? How much do we do pastoral care inside? How do we put our focus? That internal-external focus is very interesting. I said I was Church of the Brethren. The Brethren support public schools and don't have private schools. We just never did. Mennonites will often have private Christian schools, and they'll think of it that way. Their history is very different. But the Brethren always said, no, we should be in public schools. And that's kind of our stance. And if you go to the Reformed Church of America, they always said we should support the public school. But the Christian Reformed Church always said, no, we should have private schools. And they support it. And those two, which are just small, diminishing denominations, can't find a way to get together. But theologically, the vision is so different about an internal, external focus. I just highlight it because we don't often think about that. Many churches will say, well, let's start a school. And then sometimes people say, why would we start a school? Why aren't we supporting our local school? But others would say, yeah, that's exactly right. But theologically, there's a lot of stuff underneath that. It seems simple at first, but there's probably more there. And then if there's any trauma done, abuse of a child, anything like this that happens in a church can really trigger anxiety, particularly you can play out, I guess I don't say too much about that. I do want to highlight just a couple of things here. Now this is a really archaic, this comes out of the work of Paul MacLean, who articulated it. We like to use this slide here. This is kind of a picture of a brain, but it's a pretty simple. And Paul MacLean, who was a researcher with the National Institute of Health in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I think he died in the 90s. I don't have a lot of it. He said humans actually have this triune brain, and it's just a funny way to think about the categorization. Neuroscientists will look at it differently today, but it was interesting. He said as humans were developing before we were mammals, we just came out of the birds, and we came out of the reptiles and other species, and we have this thing called what he called the reptilian brain. It's just the brain stem, and the brain stem cares for what reptiles care for, and that is territory and food and mating. Do they care for anything else? Not much else. And if you have an alligator, what's an alligator? It's kind of that. But he calls it this reptilian brain. And he said, we actually have, as humans evolved through the millennia, then we developed this mammalian brain. Mammals are so different. And so a mammalian brain is so different because you have to have this sense of caring and love and response. So if a baby cries, it will trigger something in you that you will just want to pick it up or care for it or see what's wrong. Just that crying sound itself will so appeal to you that you'll respond to it. And we are that way. We're constantly looking around, and we talked a little bit yesterday about togetherness forces. This is really that limbic system, the ability to be playful and fun, to be interactive, to be together, to share jokes, to laugh. This is real. Mammals do this stuff, Puppies play, roll on each other, like to be touched, like to be hugged, all of that. If you have a pet snake, they try to be warm, they try to be cold, but if you dangle a little thread in front of their face, you just don't get the same response as you do with your cat. And then, of course, the mammalian brain, sort of rational thought. And the idea, though, is that when you become more stressed, you can move from that rational, reflective, thoughtful way into something more reactive until you're down into that fight-flight sort of mode. And anxiety can get so high that people will, I haven't gone home for 3-4 years now. Well, why? There's anxiety in the family, so you're fleeing in a way. So you can get this reptilian regression. Have you been around people who you just say one word and they pounce? They're like that coiled snake. You just say one word and we literally use the term, bite your head off. Well, that's reptilian regression. They're just highly anxious, highly stressed, highly reactive, and they're just going to pounce. And you just have that sense about it. And why do we bring it in this workshop? Because when we're together, we have to step back. We don't want the reactivity. Make people aware, oh yeah, I've been reactive. I get, the things I get reactive on. Just to illustrate this a little further, then, there was a program called Roots of Empathy, and this was done in Canada, and they felt like the children weren't growing up as compassionate as they thought they should be. And they would bring in a mother with a child once a week in the afternoon and say, just bring in your child, and as the child's growing and playing, our kids will get to watch it a little bit, and it won't be that disruptive. So this was the program, and it's a way to get out. You can see the babies there just kind of playing with these balls and not paying attention. But you can see the face on the other children. They're just so calm, so relaxed, so engaged in it. And that's how humans respond one to another. They're just fully there. And the reason I say it is because you can take one look at that picture. You don't know anything about that picture, but you can tell it's a positive picture. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to talk about it. You just have one glance, and automatically your brain has processed what's going on in that picture. This picture, it might be hard for you to see, the colors aren't that great, but if you could see it a little better, you would see that you have a mother. It looks like she's got her child in the front there, and she's holding the child. But all the faces are just blank. And if you look back at the other father, the daughter, she's got her arm, the father's holding it, and the third child there, kind of the middle child, she probably has an arm. She has to be touching the father. And again, the picture's not very clear, but this was a bombing in London, in the underground, and after the bombing took place, these people are running away, but if you could see their face, you would see they're just flat and dead, no smiles, no life, and you will immediately pick up that they're being anxious. And as humans, we just are finally in tune when people are anxious. So imagine you growing up, father comes home 5 o'clock, gets out of the car, you take one glance, and you think, oh, I'm heading out the back door or something. You can pick up on when someone's happy, when they're angry, when they're worried, and we're finely tuned to it. And how do we respond, and what's that look like? That's the next question. So that's anxiety. With it, I'm going to move on. Let's see what time it is. 10:56. I think I want to take about a 10-minute break at this point before I go into this discussion about this church. I just feel, let's get up, stretch our legs for about 10 minutes at this point. Any questions? I know that's pretty straightforward, just about anxiety and stress, but I know we had coffee and we had our donuts. Might be a good time just to take a break. The next session will be about 20 minutes, so I think it's going to be a little longer.
Thank you.
Never knew I had so much power.
I mean, if there's somebody who needs a lot of work,
Sure, he's sitting right under us. Yeah. Good Friday. Yes. Yeah. Not well.
That's Laura, who's a friend of mine. So I get to see him because I'm part of the revolution doing different jobs.
Yeah.
Laura works with him.
Robert, you listen to shelter place.
Yeah, I thought Eugene O'neill. Well, I think
Judy's on. Yep.
What are the relationships? And then how one can say,
Richard Allentown, Gary Still, Betty Henninger, Judy.
I mean, and that's what you see also in
Oh, gosh.
I put down this report. I didn't like it. Why am I doing this? But this wasn't exactly how I envisioned.
well, and that system is attracted to you because you create a kind of good space and then so then when you start having motivational systems with that start of the system is
What are you making?
see Lily next week, so I need to make
How long are you here?
just the weekend.
Just a weekend? California? Oh, okay. Good. How is it? She knows. Great. Gonna give mom and dad a run. She's running, of course. Skip right over that walking part. Yeah, that's overrated. There you go. That'll do it. I would think it could change their lifestyle drastically. Yeah. Yeah, we're here. What's the big deal, right? Yeah. But now try to do something else. Yeah.
Another knitter who I started with the women tour through on it with, I mean, like it was Aaron Johnson who actually sat next to me and I did it in the summer when they had a meeting in the summer. So I'm working on it. I'm not going to be like have you knitted for a long time?
I actually started. I put it down and didn't touch it for like 10 years. And then about 5 years ago, there was actually a group of friends that I was with who decided that everybody's going to really like start something up again. And one of my friends had another friend who teaches knitting classes, and she does stuff like just in the school. So we found that take like an 8-week class. It's like $30 at a local school, and we did it. My children came in, and she walked us through it. We did that for a year. It was just nice to get to kind of sit and talk and something to do together. And I just kind of been doing it on my own ever since. Nothing really complicated.
Oh, I mean, I made hats.
Yeah.
And I just started the bigger but I love this. Because, like, this is something you got or no?
These are big. Circular needles are really great. I have a nice
I
set of
love
them.
that.
And usually it's for my nieces and nephews.
Well,
A lot of it's for them.
It's like a blue and blue. So if you're not part of
That's all right. Actually, you know,
yeah, really.
I just look like that. Oh, yeah.
Very effective. So
Yeah,
I wasn't. So
there you go. I have a pattern in the yard of my nieces. I don't know year and a half. I just start off. No, I got it all. I think when I stick with the smaller pieces better. This is just like a little bit. I mean, it's a simple. It's a seed. It's like knit girl, knit girl.
At many points, it's just I have to have something to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Just addictive. In a good way.
It is. It is. And it's kind of relaxing as long as we're
Enjoy.
How are you, John?
Okay, did you give up on doing audio for the...
No, but we were away for like 5 Sundays as well.
Oh, is that right?
So that's traveling, and then our grandkids were going to play musical out.
You just haven't been here for a
So
while.
we haven't been here.
Oh, I see.
In fact, our Easter was the first Sunday we've been back for like 6 weeks.
Okay.
So yeah, I just got an email to sign up.
I get these every week, and I see there's no one doing audio for 11 o'clock, so I put my name in. Okay, so Madison does it. Really? My granddaughter. I don't do it. I haven't yet. But, I mean, if you're in the mix, you know...
Yeah, I'm going to take a
if
look
you're
at
interested.
it. Oh, no, I was planning on doing it. I just wasn't able to.
Yeah. How about some of the other things like the like this,
Well, this
projection?
I talked to Dave one day about it. I said, "What's involved with it?" My only concern is if I have to put the thing together, I'll screw it up. I guarantee I'll screw it up.
But if
It's just running.
I don't think they've gone through their chocolates yet, Jan, so we don't have to, without, well, this time we'd have to reload, but I think we're still good. We're still overcoming our Easter candies. Are we ready? I'm gonna get going. Does anyone recognize this picture? You're too old to recognize it? Anybody recognize this photo? Say it again. It's a music group. Los Lobos. And what song did they sing? La 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 la. You know that song? Los Lobos. Mexican American band from LA. I'm going to start talking about a church now, but a pastor of a church in Methodist church down in Texas thought that this would be a model photograph to reach their community, and dressed up with the associate pastor and the music director to go on television dressed like Los Lobos to invite people to church. Black tie, dark sunglasses, black suits, tucked sideways, come worship with us. Would that work here? In Allentown?
Give it a try, Stephen.
The Spice Girls might work. This is 2000 rural Texas, and one pastor lost his job because he came into the office in a pair of blue jeans. Suit and tie, nothing else. Suit and tie. Southern culture, right? Buckle of the Bible belt. This pastor thought, how are we going to reach out to the Mexican American community? Come worship with us. Do you think that triggered, oh, I don't know, old versus new anxieties in the church? So for people who weren't here last night, I highlighted the call that, the president made to my office. This pastor is acting more like a CEO than a pastor, right? And it triggered an event. Well, this going on, imagine you turn on the television and there's your pastor. Just looks like this. Is that an embarrassment? Is it sacrilegious? Is it disrespectful? I'm trying to find the right words. I can't, so lost my words. But with that, anyway, that was a precipitating event. So we talked a little bit about chronic anxiety, that if there's chronic anxiety within a system, an event will trigger an explosion, right? So you could say, oh, Pastor, that was too much, you're over your skis here or something, but that's not what happened. Full church mediation, just major split. So let me walk through it a little. I didn't get the picture of the three pastors, though they would have looked like kind of white guys pretending to be. That would have been the part that would have been inauthentic, right? That would have been a different side of that. Let me kind of walk through it. I'll try to go through it a little bit quickly, but I think it's informative, and we do it. So the church secretary was resigning, and I set it up last night that he even fired the church secretary. She was actually resigning and retiring, but you never know which comes first, right? If you work in a corporation, was it really a resignation or was it being forced out? And the church secretary, I talked a little bit about the song leader, I'll say it here, but everything ran through the church secretary. So if you had a funeral, your father died, and you're worried about the flowers for the funeral, will there be a meal served, all the accommodations, right? You'd be calling the church secretary, organizing everything. She would make sure everything would get scheduled. Kids are going on a mission trip out camping or something, all the forms, what do I need? She'd be there. You're the Sunday school teacher, I need curriculum. She's there. Oh, it's a big wedding. Do we have a photographer? Do we have this? She's there, right? Kind of an anchor of the church, really an important face of the church. So when they thought this pastor was terminating her, it really triggered a lot of anxiety. So a moment of acute anxiety blown out proportion due to the chronic anxiety within the system, sort of lighting the fuse, if you will, in that way. So it's kind of venting the chronic anxiety within the system. And then the sense of a disruption of homeostasis and the sense and loss and replacement of leadership, that the loss of this individual, that kind of, like I said with my Uncle Arnie at the family level, kind of holding things together. It was kind of a disruption. Let me briefly walk through the church history. It's kind of interesting. Someone asked me about it last night. I don't see her. I do see her. She said, I know the Methodist in Texas. Who was it? But I'll try not to disclose it. But so in Texas, they did, I don't know how they, I guess I don't know how they name things in Pennsylvania real well, but in Texas, Houston, Austin, I'm a big guy, right? All hat, all cattle. I want this named after me. So the town was named after one individual, and the county was named after this individual, probably a cattle farmer, a rancher, I guess. I don't know what it was exactly. So the town was formed 1861, and he donates land for the church. Okay? So this is how it all gets started. One wealthy landowner starts a town, and he builds the church. Okay? I'll just plug that in. So that's how it gets started. Old Methodist Church in 1902, there's a revival meeting. This is on their website. It's still on their website. Interesting. I looked it up just a few weeks back. But the congregation gets motivated to build a new church because a generous donor stepped in and said, let's tear down the old church and build a new church. And they got into, okay, yeah, right, let's do that. They did it. 2 years later, or 3-4 years later, the church gets burnt. And then the congregation says, no, we'll go back to the old church and we'll contribute our money to build it this time. This is in their archives, right? This is who we are. They want us people to know about it. So the present sanctuary gets built in 1951. Education building gets dedicated a few years later. The Christian Life Center gets completed in 2000, though it took 10 years. There was problems. It was 10 years to get into it. There were real problems because, this is the pastor that had the blue jeans on. And then some of the wealthy donors said, oh, we're not going to give to that. So they didn't give. They had this half-built building in the middle of the downtown that just sat there month after month after month, right? And it triggers some of the problems. Let me walk through this a little bit. This is the town, for those who weren't here last night, where the pastor said, I'm the 5th pastor in an 8-year-old personage. To give you a sense of that sums it up, I think, a little bit. So from 1948 to 2006, the congregation had 12 lead pastors. You average it out, that seems pretty normal. But all of the last 3 pastors had only served 2 years. No intervals. 2 years. That's where you get the 5 pastors, 8 years. Senior pastors coming in, going out. Since 1969, this flagship, as I call it, had 5 associates. The current associate had served for 17 years. So they just kept moving. The senior pastor kept the associate. That's significant. I don't apply it here in that way. That's significant. I'll come back to that. It looks like you guys love this. The other point about this church that's really interesting is that it was very wealthy and they enjoyed the wealth. And many of the members, they were into development. So this is where they would build big reservoirs. And then you could do boating, fishing, you could have golf courses. And you build houses around the reservoirs. That's how they made their money, right? And I said, if you've ever served this church as a senior pastor, and you come back, we will build your home to your part. Is that a contribution? So many pastors did. They'd come back. So the church was full of retired pastors. One lady said, I haven't been to the main service in 15 years. It's so convenient. I just drive into the side of the church, park my car, and I go with this retired pastor. We have Sunday school. We take up an offering. We have mission projects. We do mission trips. We have a separate financial budget. And that's how they did their life. And others were others. So this whole church, you had these 4 or 5 different retired pastors, and they had their own system going on. So this is why the senior pastor, we have these retired pastors. We need that. One of the mediation process was an agreement that all the finances would actually run through the church office. That was one of the major agreements. It'd be a healthier church if we didn't have 6 bank accounts. Anyway, I'll say just a couple more about it. But the culture was changing in the town, a sense that it was losing its place in town. So this is Main Street America, classic Main Street America. Everything was downtown, all the hardware stores, barber shops, car dealers, everything was downtown. But in Main Street America, what happens? You build a mall on the outside of town, and some 20 miles away, there was a big university. The airport gets relocated down by the university. The industrial complex, manufacturing, research, etc., down toward the university. Everything moves out. The First Baptist Church, some 10 years before the mediation, actually closed its doors and left. There's no point in being there. But you know what happens in the downtowns, and this is Texas, so you have Mexicans coming in and opening up their little shops, so supermercados and taquerias and sort of these things, right? And other buildings get mothballed in that way. So there was a real transition in culture, and a new pastor comes in and says, the town, there's plenty of people here, but they're Hispanic speaking, let's reach out. And that triggers a response as well. So that's the Los Lobos that comes up in that way. Let's reach out, and that triggers it. Some years back, though, there was a terrible car crash, early 70s, and the pastor, his son was 18, car crash, became quadriplegic. The church rallied together and said, okay, we'll take care of the church, you take care of your family. And this is when these retired pastors could really step up and kind of take the lead. So it had really unusual leadership. And then the financial issues were always such that they were constantly looking to the donors. And this new pastor, the one dressed like Los Lobos, he said, I'm not going to be, what was his phrase? I'm not going to be the preacher in the donor's pocket, something like that. I can't quite get that phrase, something like that, right? I'm not going to be the preacher in the something pocket. That style. And then the pastor's style, it just didn't like too casual, too flippant, and it really put some strain on it. So I mapped it out, so it was a traditional church down Main Street. You had these founding members. My family's been here, and you heard that last night, right? The sense of ownership that they felt like they had because, we started this church, my great-grandfather did all that. Then you had these retired pastors that were there, and they, if your kids are growing up, getting confirmed, getting married, whoever the pastor is at that age, you really connect to that pastor. You're deeply involved in the church, so you can tell how old people were based on which Sunday school they would go to and who they connected with. You could immediately know. And then they had these new families that were kind of Hispanic, and they were working together, but they had this core, it was going and it was held together pretty well. So you had this music director, great guy, the associate, great guy, and the church secretary kind of holding it all together. New pastor comes in and they think, oh no, he's going to disrupt this and it's all going to lose. How are we going to hold together if we continue down this road, if you will? So here's a quote that Friedman puts together. The challenge, this is a quote that we put in the annual report as we were putting it together. We summarized it this way and said the challenge of the congregation has been to develop a leadership balance that connects with all the sectors of the congregation. The pillars, new families, old church, new church, etc., and develop a focus of mission that incorporates the interests of all. And it's crucial for leaders to be thoughtful in defining self, maintaining boundaries, and staying in emotional contact with all segments of the congregation. So the new pastor was kind of leaning toward these new families, and the older folks didn't like it so much. So how do you incorporate it all together? And then recognizing how all the different ministers complemented one another. So, and it played out. So this is from their website today. I went back some, 20 years later. I guess not quite 20 years. And looked at it. So this is the flagship. The district superintendent used to have the office and then moved it. I guess that's a parallel here as well. Very similar in a way, but we were the main church in the main town, but then the town left. So who are we in that way? Well, listen to this mission statement and see if it summarizes an effective mediation. It said, we are a historic church with a great legacy, but we are also a contemporary church with a passion for the city and ministries that impact our community. Isn't that great? They recognize their history, they own it, they step into it, but also we're up to date, we're reaching out, we're part of the community, we're not closing and we're not moving, we're here. And if you go to the website, you can say there's some Spanish-speaking services that are there, there's other ministries that are there. Those weren't there before, but they kind of came together and moved forward. But you can see just a lot of anxiety in the system, what to do with these retired pastors, how to incorporate them more, some of the stresses of the whole town. I didn't go into all the demographics, but demographics, the downtown, it's going up 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, everything more, bigger, all this. All of a sudden they get sort of mid-80s, and then all the numbers start dropping off, right, as people leave and get jobs elsewhere. And these are the type of things that were really triggering some of that. I don't think it's something for Gary Stone, but I can't let him.
I got it.
Oh. sorry, I don't know why one doesn't. Here's the last quote by Friedman. I think it was a good lesson for the pastor that was there. He stayed on and really had a good ministry for a long period in that church. It was really great. This is from Friedman. Friedman says, to become a leader of a new family, one must become its head. If it's an established family, then one will not emerge as its head through some natural process of that organism's growth. In such a transplant time must be allowed for the graft to take place. In fact, if entering clergy would make this their main priority for the first year or two, rather than hurrying to introduce new programs, not only will they increase their chance of a long-lasting marriage, they are also more likely to see those programs accepted. In this church, the new pastor came in and he said, he's acting like a CEO, he's changing everything. And in the first month, he's going to change this, he's going to change that. But he didn't really connect to the different groups, so he didn't get the buy-in and the support that he really needed. And this is what Friedman is saying. Spend some time, get to know people, and then move into that ministry. And that was a really helpful part for his ministry to move forward. But he was moving too fast. And just like we said, in the video last night, there was a sense that the pastor was forcing change down everybody's throat, and they didn't like it, so they were kind of stepping back. So the anxiety plays out in the family, but it plays out in churches as well. The things from the past, if you're a church that have one or two wealthy donors and they support everything, I remember one person said at that mediation that the pastor was preaching, he gave some analogy, and everyone's looking over at these one or two wealthy people, and at a certain point, one of them rolled his eyes, and they knew, oh no, we're going to have conflict, because they would withhold their money, and it would shut down the programs of the church. So everyone's going to have an eye on, how's he taking this? How's he taking this? Not going to be the preacher. All right. This is on B3, and then we'll do some group work in just a second. Let me highlight. Just talking about, well, if you do have a lot of anxiety within the church system, what are some of the typical characteristics of the church system? And we saw a lot of this last night, so I won't spend a great deal of time on it, but let's look at a couple of these things here. So the first thing you'll know about, well, let me read them out. Friedman says you're going to get reactivity, the sense of hurting. I want to talk a little bit about the sense of blaming, kind of a quick fix, and then poorly defined leadership. So let me go through each of them. And again, this is on B3 there. So in a church or in a family where there is a lot of anxiety, people are on edge, they're really edgy, and they have kind of these automatic, intense responses. It just comes out, sort of that reptilian aggression. It just comes out automatically. People just, you come up with a new idea, oh, that'll never work. We tried that before. You just say something and people just shoot it down immediately. They don't listen, they don't try to tease out ideas, they're not trying to learn. We saw in that video last night, right? Constantly learning, they're not constantly learning. Just shoot it down, so you get this intense automatic response. You can tell there's some reptilian aggression going on. The other thing is there's a real serious tone about it. I went to that Methodist church, doing a workshop, made a joke about something. We do this Amish bishop story sometimes. It's kind of funny, and nobody laughed. You just know it just falls completely flat. That playfulness, no, there's nothing playful. They're sitting there just looking like this the whole night. Like nobody's happy, just waiting for something, watching what others are going to do, really guarded and careful, if you will. And then with that, you get a real failure of the imagination, just being creative, spontaneous, thinking of new ideas, new directions. Let's try this. People will shoot you down. There's personal attacks that go on. And because of that, you don't want to say anything, right? Where's the safest place for the head of a turtle? In the shell, right? like classic Chinese, let 1,000 roses bloom or whatever, that sense that, and then you cut them off. So the safe place, what? Put the head in the shell. You don't want to risk anything like that. So a real failure of imagination, creative thinking, new ideas, new thought, you kind of shut all those things down. And then attacks on individuals. And we saw a lot of that in the video last time. In fact, the worship leader had to tell them, okay, hey, let's not get personal. And then how about this, covert and secretive? The letter writing campaigns, we had that in the video, that sort of stuff. Hey, we're meeting at so-and-so's house, but we don't want anyone to know. So you get that secretive, because if you do things transparently, you get attacked for it. So you have this sense, you want to be careful and guarded about what you say. You kind of want to test the water. Who's on your side, who's not on your side. So you begin to kind of get a feel for who's with you and who's against you, so you can test the water. The second thing here then is this idea of herding. And herding is a little different, but you group up. I had a friend, he was a farmer in Nebraska, and he had an old Chevy. It was a 350, and this will mean something to some. It was an old 350 Chevy, and he had a way that he could kind of rev it up, he'd turn it off, and he'd pump the gas, and he'd turn it back on or something, get it neutral. I can't remember what he'd say, but if he did it just right, he would get this huge backfire explosion. It would just boom, like this. And in their field, they had cattle and sheep together. And he would love to do this, because as soon as it would explode, all the cattle would go to one group, and all the sheep would go to another group. And he always wondered, how do they know, which cow or which place? Because in different fields, they would gather, different parts. They would just kind of come together. But it would be just that sense that the explosion, and everybody herds up together. And we could see that in the video last night, kind of the older folks were herding up, and Jeannie was kind of, the center of all that, and younger people were kind of herding up. But this other notion then with that is taking on the herds of others. So Jeannie was, I'm going to save the church. She was a campaign for that. So the needs were mentioned, and people were anxious, and she was going to step in and really help that situation as well. And they have told the story, but I was doing a merger of two churches, and the one church, this family, a husband and wife, they were the ones that were taking on the hurts of others, and they were really anxious, and they were kind of save the church, and they were opposed to this merger at first. And the two churches came together for joint worship before they had an official vote from the congregations and actually changed the status of the churches within the Presbyterian. But one day, we were doing listening small group, and this man said, I love the pipe organ. Wonderful, love it. And I love the pianist and the piano, and I love the piano. But when you play a clarinet in the sanctuary, you have crossed the boundary. What do you think of it? He was on a campaign to fight the merger, anything he could do, and that's just the reactivity. It made no sense. My wife's a clarinet, right? But when you play a clarinet in the sanctuary, you have crossed the boundaries. It was too much. Another woman, I was telling Jan this story last night, that they were doing joint worship, and the acolyte came with, to light the Christ candle, as they did in their church. And as they were moving up to the chancel, then one of the musicians was trying to plug in his electric guitar and came running across with the cable and almost knocked the boy over. And for her, that was too much. I agree with that. But being extremely sensitive to and then taking up the cause on behalf of others, there's that sense of hurting. And with that, though, is that people begin to feel and think, you kind of get this group thing going on. You'll see it in politics, you'll see it in workplaces, you'll see it elsewhere. you get this group think, it's kind of the same thing, and you can almost hear the conversation in advance because you've heard it before, so you have that sense about it. And with it, it becomes cancerous and it can really spread, if you will. And then there's a real adaptation to weakness and this sense of a pseudo peace. Jeannie, if she could have got rid of that contemporary worship, she would have felt like the church was at peace, but it wouldn't have really been at peace. It would have been kind of a pseudo peace, if you will, with that. The sense of hurting and being sucked in. I talked about togetherness forces yesterday, this Galabi togetherness. All right, the third one then is blaming here. We know what this is like, really accusing the other of causing all the problems. We saw it in the Methodist Church, blaming the pastor, and that never seeing ourselves as part of the problem, never seeing ourselves as part of a system that's creating the problem or being challenged by the problem. So you begin with this idea of scapegoating someone in that way, and then trying to sabotage their work. So those two go. So it's kind of a victim mentality. Things are wrong because of that, and then faulting others for our own unhappiness with that. It says in your book about cynical pessimism, if you will, leaders becoming the focus of blame, being cynical. Is there a comment? No. And with this, then the fourth one, quick fix mentality in a family or a church or an organization that's anxious, you'll kind of do a quick fix. You see it in football teams, they'll do a quick fix, they won't know what to do, and they'll go out and spend a lot of money for the Chicago Bears, for an example. So the Chicago Bears are terrible. What they'll do when there's anxiety is they'll run out and get like a middle linebacker or a defensive player. So the Chicago Bears is running back and defense, which is useless in the modern NFL. But anyway, so they'll go out and get a Khalil Mack. Oh, let's go get this. So they'll spend all this money on a defensive player. They won't do anything, but that'll fix our problem, right? Well, what about a quarterback? Quarterback? Yeah, no, we didn't get a quarterback. We never had a quarterback. We just throw someone in there, but quick fix. Well, what's the other thing you do in your Chicago? Well, you change the coach. The coach. Get rid of the coach. You're going to still have the same players, right? You still don't have a quarterback, right? Yeah, no, we need a new coach. So I think we have a new coach again this year. I lose track. Keep track exactly, but you see it in others. What's the quick fix? So in churches, quick fix, it's often the pastor who bears the brunt of it. But there's other quick fixes. A CRC church, south side of Chicago, they were moving and it felt like if they were 10 miles further south, there was more growth, it was the better place to be, their building was old, they just felt like it should be time to change. And it's a pretty anxious decision to do it. And they said, can you help us? And then in a minute, peace out, and got this long, slow process, as we know. We said, well, we think we should do some listening, we should do this. Oh, people are too anxious for that, so they bring it to a vote. Should we sell our building? Yeah. Bring it to a vote. So they brought it to a vote. And the vote was 70% in favor, 30% against. Right? Brought it to a vote. Needed 2/3 majority and passed. They were elated. Except that in the meeting, someone raised their hand and said, it feels like white flight to me. It feels like, I appreciate all you said about growth and movement and all that, but it also feels about white flight, and I question our mission to the community. People said, we hadn't talked about it. They didn't have deep discussion, because it was a lot of money, big decision. What do we do? Let's get into a vote, we can move on. So, and others talked, and they said, I feel called to the community. I don't feel called to the denomination of this church per se. I feel called to the community. And others start talking, and then pretty soon that 30% said, maybe we should just stay with the building, whoever buys it, and we can continue our work and our outreach. Well, if you have a mortgage from a bank, and you just thought, you just lost 30% of your pledging families, then that mortgage is really in jeopardy. And then they call this again and say, can you kind of help us, kind of patch it together, but it's a little bit difficult at that point. But let's hurry and get it to a vote. If we could just get a vote, and move forward without recognizing that that quick fix is often coming out the fact that we're having difficulty making this decision. I get into this analysis by paralysis. I go the opposite way. I never push for anything. I get stuck. I'm thinking. We were trying to buy a new car, and my wife always has to push me because once you get every car company, pros and cons, pricing, pros and cons, dealers, pros and cons, but it's constantly changing. So if you're constantly trying to get information, you never get it. You kind of get stuck just analyzing, thinking. So she's the one that often has to push us. Let's just go on. But it's kind of the opposite, right? You get stuck in this analysis. But the other side is I'm so anxious, I'm just gonna pick something and move forward. But often it's a reflection. You're demanding a certainty. The merger of these two churches, a lot of folks were anxious about it, wanted to vote. And I said that it's too early to vote. We have to talk, we have to think. And in the end, even the man who was opposed to the clarinet, he said, well, I can sit in the bathroom. He voted for it, but he's like, yeah, I can, if I have to, I can go out the back. That was the way he put it. I'll vote for this, but I'm not gonna. They kind of came around, but if we had an early vote, he would have voted against it, just out of reaction. I don't recommend him, but in the end, he voted for it. So that's kind of symptom relief, not ability to be patient. And then the real problem is the long term, the deep causes, the root causes, some of those issues are never addressed with that. So you're trying to get symptom relief, so you don't really want to do deep problem solving in a systematic way. And then often it's an all or nothing kind of vote, or forcing the problem to get out. And then these systems, often you have poorly defined leaderships as well. So when Jeannie said in the video last night, I'm past president, of course she was president. The most reactive, most impassioned, most everything. It's like, oh, she really cares. And it'll shut her up if we make her president. So that's probably what happened. But you have to say, okay, we'll give it to you to run then. So she wasn't coming out of like vision, beliefs, or principles. She's functioning out of this intense reactivity, right? So it's hard. And then the agenda gets set by crisis in the video. People are complaining, and then the worship committee's reacting, and I'm just complaining, they react. So you get kind of, what is the fire that we have to put out this way? It's kind of that agenda being set by the crisis, not being able to long-term systematic planning. And then it's hard for people to take well-defined stands in the midst of all the reactivity. So people are going to be angry and ugly about it, so it's hard to kind of say, no, this is really the right thing to do. This is what I think we should do, because people are reactive. And so you get leaders then in a reactive system that have a hard time doing that. And then the least mature are often selected to lead. They're the most passionate, most reactive, is what happened in Jeannie, not the most thoughtful, patient, if you will. And then when, last time we talked a lot about plan B, we knew that there'd be some trouble, so we have plan B. Often you have leaders that once the sabotage and the reactivity kicks in, they have difficulty. When we did the merge of these church, I said there was a lot of reactivity illustrated by this clarinet comment. And had to do some coaching of folks to just stay present, stay available, keep listening, keep talking, don't give up just because of that. Don't take it too seriously. Understand that it's difficult, it's change. People have an initial reaction, but just be present, be available, have another meeting, kind of sit with them and it'll move through. But often that first wave of criticism seems so intense that people go, well, okay, maybe we should modify it, maybe we need to step back, if you will. And then, so how does it happen then? Well, if there's anxiety, it limits our resiliency. And if you lose your resiliency, what happens is you'll see that a lot of people, I don't want to be part of session, or I don't want to be on the vestry, or I don't want to be in leadership. People get tired, they begin to quit, clergy begin to quit. Someone shared recently about churches down in Richmond, 40% of the churches, no pastors, and just a difficulty getting clergy. It's just hard, we get worn down in the midst of that work. So there's a real fatigue, I guess, clergy fatigue, I think the phrase for that. There's anxiety, it always magnifies differences. Who's for us, who's against us, who's in our group, and we tend not to see the commonalities, the things we celebrate together, but we see the things that are dividing us. We saw a lot of the differences in the video last night, but not a lot of things that they celebrated together as a worship community. That's an important. Constraining imaginative capacities. Again, no imagination coming out. Intense demand for certainty, this diagnosis of others, and then finally a lot of secrecy, and then ultimately a lot of cutoffs that take place.
Jay, there's a question in the chat. Can you see the chat? I'll read it to you if you can.
I can't, for some reason my program is not working.
Yep. So Rich is asking, I'm curious about the item under quick fix mentality that says emphasis on data and technique. I don't think he commented on that. What does it mean?
Yeah, sometimes when people are anxious, they get the sense that if I have more data, it'll help me, and they're reluctant to just take a stand and move forward with it in that way. And the thought that if I get the right answers, somehow it will resolve this. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the afternoon, and maybe I'll defer to that. When I get anxious, I'm always looking for more data. I just somehow think the data will resolve the issue for me, that somehow it'll all get pieced together for me. I was working with a Mennonite church in Indiana, and we said we'd do this process, and they said, oh no, we need a church consultant to come in. The church is too small, they need to merge or close, but they don't want to make that decision, and they can't make it. So their idea is, let's get a consultant to kind of tell us how we're going to increase the youth or increase the number, and we're going to have this special or that special. That's kind of a reliance on data. They know exactly what's going to happen. They just haven't been able to face it. So they're asking for someone to kind of come in and say, oh, if you just had this or had that, you would resolve it. That's kind of a quest for data and avoidance of making a hard decision. Can't think. We'll see more of that in the afternoon. We'll get a better answer to that one. If that was Richard, thank you for that comment. That's really an important one in a way. So sometimes we know the decisions that need to be made, but we just don't want to quite make it somehow. So I'll give you an example with a family recently. A neighbor of mine just passed away. We had his funeral. He had 2 daughters. So the man was a dairy farmer. I used to work for him growing up, bathing and stuff, but he was living alone, and he just couldn't walk. He was unstable. And he told his 2 daughters, like, you need to put your father in a home or something. My sister was taking care of him. Oh, no, and well, with the pandemic, and so we need just a little more information, and, we're calling around to different homes, and we don't know what is right, and this and that. Well, the father falls and goes to the hospital, broken hip, gets COVID, and then dies sort of in that process. They just couldn't make a decision. He was kind of beyond the ability to make a decision. That was like, we need to know a little this or know a little that. And It was obvious it was just time that they didn't have the ability to step up and make that decision. It's not uncommon, I guess. I don't know how to say it. Maybe it's not a good example. All right, let's do some group work. I've done lots of talking. We're going to turn over and just spend a little bit of time on B4. We'll give you about 15 minutes or something because you're going to have to read it. So this is a case of anxiety. This is the story of Moses and Aaron. And so we listed out those 10 characteristics of anxiety, mourning, worship, etc. But on this other page, B3, there's some typical characteristics: reactivity, hurting, blaming, quick fix, and poorly defined leadership. So I'm going to ask you to kind of read the passage together and then just spend some time. Where do you see some of these characteristics of anxiety playing out in the midst of it? Does that make sense? Before, and then you'll, Stephen, if you could do the small group and get that set up.
Your position at
Yeah, you're going past
back
Moses
of
and
the
Aaron.
chancel,
And Aaron's
steps
brother
coming up behind the choir look, and at the beginning of the service, and I used to warn them, I said, in a minute or two, it's going to get really, really loud.
It's pretty straight. What
And
we're
it just
trying to
echoed
do in this
in the spot where we were,
exercise
so
is
it
not
seemed like
rewrite
twice
Old
as loud.
Testament in a
But
theological
it was
sense.
like,
We're just
we
trying
know
to
it's
get
only
us
been
to
5
think.
minutes that these people haven't
You
been
get
able
so
to
plugged
talk,
into
but
the
it
content
sounds
issues
like it's
that
been
you miss
years.
the emotional process on
And
the
there were a couple
outside.
of those
So
kids
I said my
who
daughter has got a roommate
afterwards
issue.
said, I'm really
She's gonna
glad
find
you said that,
100
because that was
reasons
kind of
why she
scary.
can't have the same roommate next year. And I could take all those reasons seriously, or I could just understand it feels a little too tight for her and she's trying to separate. We're getting a little bit of this, the reactivity.
Judy, can you hear us?
Quick, give me your goal and I'll make this. There are some challenges there. Let's have one brief conversation. What was going on with Moses? How do you interpret Moses in the midst of leadership in this story? What do you think of Moses? Somebody want to join us? What did you come to? Yeah, say it, then I'll repeat it. So I'll repeat it for our folks on Zoom. So Moses abandoned ship. He wouldn't come down off the mountain in that way. We don't know if that was his intention exactly, but clearly Aaron was not prepared to take over, was he? So what about a sense of mission or vision between Moses and Aaron and the people? How did you interpret that part of the story?
They just went back to what they knew.
They went back to what they knew. So the natural default mode was to go back to the old thing, back to the way of Egypt. So we're anxious, we don't know. So is that a lack of imagination? Isn't that fundamentally exactly what they did, even to the point of creating? Yeah, and then.
It's either that or they didn't have good communication, so that when Moses went away for a while, people didn't know how they were supposed to act. They had better communication on that.
Yeah, let me try to repeat that then. It's kind of a lack of communication. When Moses left, there was no preparation what to do in that sense. So Moses, as I read the story, it's like, well, I'll just pick up and go. And what kind of leadership is that? I don't know. But then nobody knows what to do. And in the absence of that shared vision, they just go back to what they had done originally. I do like how Aaron quickly blames, it is like these people that God gave us. So here you get this triangle, we'll talk about triangles. You get the Aaron-Moses triangle, and the people are on the outside, and the two of them are like analyzing and gossiping and talking about those people. You and me, we're in the know, we're the smart ones, but those people, so, that's a classic triangle.
Hey, Jay, we've got a response from somebody online.
Yeah, thanks.
We had to remember that Aaron was involved. He failed as a leader, but didn't he still go forward and lead and enter the promised land?
Yeah.
God didn't punish him, and he matured as a leader.
Absolutely. Amen. I didn't mean to throw Aaron. If any of us says we're without sin, we deceive ourselves. But I didn't mean to, let me get organized here. That's absolutely right. God uses all of us in the midst of the challenges. And Aaron's rod that budded, of course, is one of the key components of the Ark of the Covenant. So I didn't mean to be, it came across as sacrilegious. That part always does it a little bit. And I apologize for that. Yeah, so we have one last comment that, you know, that what they really lacked was a music director. So we kind of have the pastor and the associate, but we don't have the music director to tie it all together. So that's a helpful understanding of that passage as well. I would guess if we went to buildings and grounds, they might describe the needs for other things. All right. We're going to move forward. I want to get to page B5, which is really important before we break for lunch. And maybe a little bit on, I'd like to get done with the blue section if we could. We go to it. There's a book that a lot of folks have read, and just to finish this conversation with anxiety a little bit, the impact of anxiety. This is a book called Canoeing the Mountains. And I talked about these church mergers that they read this book first, and the analogy was in the expedition, the Cora Discovery, I think it was called, the Lewis and Clark expedition. They traveled and they got to the end of the Missouri River up in Yellowstone or whatever, and they were thinking they would find a water passage to the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean, and then so they climb up, they get as far up the headwaters as they could canoe, and they hike up with the canoe thinking that they go up before the canoes, I guess. They look over thinking maybe they would find a stream on the other side or some sense they would follow, and then get up there, and it's completely different. And they realize that, oh, this is not going to work. So it was a question that at least the Western world had been asking for hundreds of years. Could you navigate by water to get to the Pacific Ocean across the U.S.? And then looked over and they took one look and then just said, oh, there's no way. And then the analogy of this book, this is by a theologian, Todd Bolsinger, also a Presbyterian minister. And he uses this as an analogy. And the last part of this quote is that this idea of how things have changed, that a generation, our world has become volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That what looked like church forever, now that we're on TikTok and we're on Zoom, and where gender is negotiated in a way. I mean, we're living in a very different world than people have lived in for centuries. I mean, just for centuries, all of a sudden it shifted, and the things that were stable that we thought we knew so well somehow are being redefined. And how are we going to live in that world? And I just highlighted, many others would highlight it in different ways, but volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. I think maybe that describes our world or not, but that certainly would describe an anxious world and how that anxiety plays out in various ways. Okay, I'm going to shift to this concept of differentiation of self, but I'm going to begin with a brief story about George Washington Carver. Do you know the name? We're that generation, we all know it. My kids, I don't know if they know it, but we know it. And in the picture is his tombstone, and at the top there's a picture of, can you see the little red thing at the far right? Anyone know what that is? Peanut butter, white peanut butter. He's the peanut guy, right? So I like the epitaph on his tombstone. I just want to read it before we go into this next stage. So George Washington Carver died in Tuskegee, Alabama, January 5th, 1943. A life that stood out as the gospel of self-forgetting service. He could have added fortune to fame, but caring for neither. He found happiness and honor in being helpful to the world. The center of his world was the South, where he was born in slavery some 79 years ago, and where he did his best work as a creative scientist. Well, isn't that a nice statement about an individual? When you hear that epitaph, you think, well, I kind of know who that person is, and I know the choices that he has made in his life. He could have been wealthy, he could have been angry against the South, but he said, no, I'm going to be a researcher at this college. I'm going to come up with things like peanut butter, and he came up with a number of inventions, and he's going to find his happiness in that, and that's what he did. So when you hear that story, again, I don't know much about George Washington Carver, so a little here and there, so the real nuts and bolts might be different. But just when I read that epitaph, I feel like there's a real solid individual, I'm going to use that term, kind of mature, clear in his thinking. These are my goals in life. This is who I am. This is what kind of brings me pleasure and honor, and I'm committed to it. I'm going to live out my life in this way. That's kind of who we did. So you can kind of almost say, what are the choices he's made and why? And you can kind of understand that as an individual. So you get a real sense of who George Washington Carver is. And I often ask myself, now, I'll say a little bit, I did my mother-in-law's funeral recently, and she passed away. I said she was concerned about right to life, and part of the funerals we talked about right to life, adoption. Some of her children adopted other needy kids. That was really important to her, and that kind of summed up her life in Christianity. As her kids got older, she would do foster care and then adopt children. That's how she spent her life, and that's kind of who she was as an individual. And we ask ourselves, who are we as individuals? What's really giving us, what's the phrase there? This idea, he found happiness and honor and being helpful to the world. What kind of gives us happiness and honor, who we are as a person? So if you died today, and someone, God forbid, right? But if someone wrote your epitaph, what would they write about you? Who you are, what's been important to you, what have you been as an individual, what do you think, what do you care about, right? We're going to move in that direction, thinking about our beliefs, our values, our priorities, in that sense. Because in the videos, we saw that first video, a lot of reactivity, anger, blaming, people jumping to and fro, as Eugene says. And the second one, more stable, more focused, more clear in their thinking, more strategic, and moving in that passion. So it's really important. All right, that's the setup. Let's turn to page B5 now. This is a little bit difficult. It's beyond my ability to describe it, but I'm going to try to. So this is differentiation of self. So I said the psychiatrist Murray Bowen was trying to figure out a way to describe why is it some families function differently than others, and why is it in a family you might have 4 children, 3 will do well in life, and then 1 seems to get bogged down in the midst of it and beyond just physical, biological reason. Why do they struggle? How do you describe these differences, and what are we actually looking at? So he tried to develop a scale that talked a little bit about individual functioning. We call it differentiation of self, and the idea is lower on this scale, individuals kind of have this sense of fusion. And here, the fusion, he thinks of it in 2 ways. One, the inability to separate thinking from feeling. So those deep reflective thoughts, where you kind of organize your thoughts and you kind of put them together and make decisions, versus something that's just kind of heartfelt and emotional. You can't figure out the difference between those. And then this idea of fusion, the degree to which one's functioning is really overly dependent and sensitive to the functioning of others. So again, he's working with schizophrenic families where a child is so keenly in tune to the mother and the child that, oh, I won't do that because that'll make mother angry, or, you know, I'll do this, that'll make mother happy. And so the whole thought goes into that relationship. Further up on the scale, he has a 0 to 100. He says this real capacity to act out of one's own beliefs and principles, but while staying in important relationships. So he maps it out, and you have this in your book. This top of the scale, well differentiated individual, as he would describe it, you have two separate circles. So I like to give the example of George Washington Carver, because he just feels like such a person. Just a real person, you know what he's doing his work, he's right there, but he's able to stay in Boland's terms. Self-differentiation is always in the context of the family or the church or the community. So the self-differentiated, he would call it emotionally mature, you can always be yourself in the midst of the family or the midst of the church. You don't have to run off to Nepal and join a monastery and kind of find yourself. That would be the epitome of non-differentiation. That would be a sense of fusion, that you're so globbed up with people, the only way you can kind of be yourself is to get completely away from them. There's so much in your head, right? That's not what he's getting at. He's not getting at kind of rugged individualism. I don't care what you say, I'm going to be myself, I'm going to go forward, demand liberty, all this. This would also be a sign of real immaturity. For Bowen, it's always in the context of the relationship. So in the midst of a family, you know, I'll tell you a brief story for me. I signed up at the University of Illinois, graduated, valedictorian of my class. Not impressive, there were only 14 of us. University of Illinois, going to be a mechanical engineer. And I thought, you know, I like nice cars, and I like nice, I'm going to make some money, I'm going to do this. And I said, you know, God got a hold of me, and I said, you know, I really want you to do mission work. Well, when I told my parents that I was not going to go to university, but I was going to go to a little Bible school and then to the Himalayas, they were so angry. My father couldn't talk to me for years. Just boiling mad. And I'll say a little bit in contrast, I guess, and here. My father thought, you know, be a pilot and do it through the military. And my father worked a lot of factory and did other jobs. He was a manager, he was college educated, a teacher. But he thought, you know, if you be a pilot, that's what you're going to do. And so that's what he wanted for us. Oh no, go to church for the poorest country in the world. And so angry. And my brother, he's down in Wyomissing, actually he flies out of Westchester. He flies for Sikorsky. He's a test pilot. The helicopter, he just tested Marine 1. The helicopter, that's what he does. I hope to see him tonight. I'll see if I can work it out. That's exactly what he did. I did just the opposite. So he got his mechanics engineering degree, flew in the Marines, and became a pilot, and continued as a test pilot. I told my father, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do church work. My mom, but later, it kind of came around. How can you tell your parents, this is who I am, this is what I want to do, but I'm going to stay in loving relationship throughout my whole life in the midst of it. And so you come home and they're talking about big helicopters, John flying, he's in Iraq, he's in Afghanistan, he did that, where have you been changed? I was in South Sudan, you know, I was in Haiti, you know, it's not, but that's who you are. But the idea is, you are your own person and your own self in the midst of the family, or you're your own person, your own self in the midst of the church. That while others are saying, we have to do this, we have to do that, you're able to think, what do I believe? What do I think is right? How am I going to stand on it, even though others are going to say and do something different? And Bowen said, some people do that better than others. And some people don't. They get sucked into, kind of like the teenager gets sucked into the emotional process. And he goes on to say that when stress increases, we have more difficulty being ourselves. When stress comes down, we do a little bit better. That's kind of the genesis of some of this. So just a couple of key points on it. So he would put us all on a scale, and he would say, typically we marry people that are similar to ourselves on a scale. And everyone says, boy, if you knew my spouse. He says there's so much giving and taking of self, and you can see that with the circles, sort of the overlap. That for some, you get in a relationship, maybe you remember the dating days, and the person is so needy, you know, you use that phrase, they're so needy or so globby. That's a sense, probably, that they're trying to fuse in the relationship a little bit more than you're comfortable with. You're like, oh, I don't like that. On the other side, someone said, well, they're so cold. They're just distant. They're just, I don't find them very friendly at all. And you get that sense like, oh, that person is just cold. Well, they're not globbing up in the way that you would think you would glob up. And you have that sense that, well, they're more cerebral, you know, sometimes we use that term in that way. So lower on the scale than more focused on one another, difficulty thinking independent thoughts, greater demands on relationships, etc. At higher on the scale, you're really open with differing thoughts. You're comfortable. You're so solid in your own thinking that others have different thoughts. You know where you stand. You know what you believe. You're not impacted in quite that way. So you're quite comfortable in having, you know, healthy dialogue and discussion. You're less anxious about others' reaction, and you have fewer demands on the relationships, if you will. Kind of down lower here, more instinctual, if you will, highly reactive to anxiety as it plays out. And up here, which is really important, we'll do a little more on this, but really grounded in your beliefs based on principled choice and less reactive to anxiety and thoughts that develop long, slow over time and kind of become who you are as a person, if you will. And then some of these patterns I'll go over in the afternoon, I won't talk about here. And then higher on the scale, relationships are a bit more calm and less tumultuous. But Bowen says that we come into life with kind of a basic level of differentiation based on, we saw Eugene O'Neill's family, and some of the children that came out of that would be just very low on the scale of differentiation. They had so much of this anxiety sort of cascading down through the generations that the children just really had difficulty dealing with life without addictions. Their relationships weren't stable, suicidal thoughts, and then suicide. Higher on the scale of functioning is different. He says as we work at it, we think, we go through life, we develop our thinking better, manage ourselves, then our functioning increases, but anxiety goes up, then our functioning decreases. So there's two key learnings that I would highlight this. When anxiety goes up, our functioning gets worse, and we often move toward more of a fusion in relationship, become more aware of our relationships, less aware of our thinking, and people can get more reactive in that, if you will. And the second thing is, I think grace, so I put myself pretty low on the scale, I can still in my own life, but the thing is to have more compassion toward others. And I think when I went into this merge of these two churches, one of our most recent mediations I did, I understood that some people would be really reactive to the change that was going to take place. And that, like speaking out against the clarinet, for example, I could understand it as not being grounded in a serious thought or a serious principle or a theological belief, but coming out of a real reactivity. And how do you provide space for those? And in Jeannie, we talked about Jeannie last night. She was pretty reactive, but they heard her. They listened to Jeannie. They were compassionate. But when you go through a significant change, an individual like that has real trouble, and you'll see it in different families. Father dies, mother dies, something like that. Certain people, I mean, we're all deeply grieved when a parent dies, but kind of we move on with life in a way. Others don't quite move on, or you have a spouse married for years, spouse dies. Some people, it's terrible, but they kind of move on with life. Others really get bogged down. This is kind of the stuff Bowen is getting at here. And what he's saying is the need for compassion and understanding. How do you manage it? How do you work with it? How do you move forward with it? But just be fully aware that if you're going to merge two congregations, sell one church, all of a sudden what happens to the graveyard, all these things where your grandmother was buried, all this stuff is going to have a real impact. How, as you as church leaders, do you manage that in accommodating when you know that some people are going to struggle with those things? I know I went over that pretty fast. We'll come back to it, but Bowen said later he wished he hadn't come up with the scale because everyone wanted to have like 25 questions that he would figure out an answer. It's not what he was trying to get at. He was trying to get at a sense of fusion and togetherness, sense of independence, and just how people function in life, just to give us a little something to think about. I think about it in terms of Christian maturity, how we move forward and how we manage the reactivities of Christ as we can. Any comments or questions on this? No, I went through it fast and it's a little bit. You'll readily recognize family members that seem to be pretty well. They just have so many difficulties in life, and others who seem to function really well. All right, I won't spend too much time on this. What this illustrates, you don't have this in your book, is if you marry people at your own sense. Bowen says in families, people kind of come in at a similar level, but when it goes down to the next generation, it sort of seems like it goes up or down with the children. So you have one wing of the family that seems to do worse and another side that seems to do better. I sit on a local school board and we're talking about social emotional learning and how do you teach social emotional learning? How do you bring it to the forefront? This quote is something I pulled that kind of defines some of that. So this comes out, it's not family systems or church. It's a sort of a secular way of saying the same thing, I think. Social emotional learning is the process in which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities. And that's kind of what we're getting at, healthy identity. Manage emotions and achieve personal and collective goals, and to feel and show empathy for others, and to establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions, right? This is kind of a very different way, but seen through a high school. I was at observing classes in the middle school at this school recently, and they have a project they're going to write. The middle schools are going to do a special project, and they're going to write children's books. And the first part of the project is going to be being with second graders, reading them books and asking what they like before they start. They're going to meet authors and do other things. It's a really nice project. So in this middle school, the head of the middle school began to read off the groups of 3. And some kids were really jumping up and down and shouting. And other kids, when they heard their groups, were really quiet. And they're sitting there, right? You can imagine, big room, 50 kids, whatever. And so based on this social emotional learning, he asked that question. When you come to your group with the sullen, quiet face, how do you think that has an impact on the other group members? If they think you don't want to be there with them, like what are you telling them and what are you thinking about in that? Beginning to bring kind of some emotional awareness. When we come together, we don't come together. I think that was an important point. But I like this. Healthy identities, manage emotion, achieve personal and collective goals, show empathy for one another, supportive relationships, and make responsible and informed decisions. That's kind of, I think, what's getting, or it should just sounds. So, one last, let me see where we're at before we Oh, I got 10 minutes, I got just enough time. So this idea of individuality and togetherness is rooted in all of this. But I want to bring in this one last concept. This is on B7 here. You can look at B6, which defines higher and lower levels of differentiation and what that looks like. So this comes back to solid self and pseudo self. And Cohen has this idea that higher on the scale of differentiation, you have more of a solid self, and lower on the scale is kind of a lot of pseudo self. This stuff you just pick up in your family, in your culture, and you kind of own it. You don't really know why. And he kind of makes a distinction between the two in a way. It's an important concept. Let's see if I can get to that. So the solid self is made up of clearly defined beliefs, convictions, opinions, life principles, each incorporated into the self from our own experiences, and after careful intellectual reading, weighing alternatives, accepting responsibility for our own choice, that each belief and principle is consistent with others, the self will take responsible action on these principles, even when the situation is really high. So this is who we are. So I don't typically steal money. I've had a lot of opportunity. I've worked in international development, and there's a lot of chance to grant money and other things, but that I just don't do it. Bribes, don't give bribes. I lived in Nigeria, I lived in India, I lived in Bangladesh. I don't give bribes. I'll sit at the airport. I'll miss my flights. I just won't do it. Sorry. I just don't give bribes. I know it's cultural. Other people will do it, whatever, right? You can have principles that you set, you believe by, you live in. Others have different principles. They change, vary. Maybe that's not a great example, but it's that sense of who you really are, make decisions, push on to shove. You say, no, I'm not moving. That's who I am. I just don't do that. The pseudo self is slightly different. I have the same thing for pseudo self here. I like this idea of territorialism in that way. So solid self, clearly defined beliefs, convictions, formed slowly, consistent with one another, and ultimately it's really the I statement. That's why I wanted to begin with George Washington Carver, that real sense of solid self. But the pseudo self is something Bowen says is really appended onto the self. These are beliefs that you have, you kind of pick up along the way. They're not really that solid. They can be changed as things change in your relationships. They're pretty inconsistent. They're pretty negotiable, kind of group think, expressed by quoting authorities, for example. Let me try to give you an illustration of this. So I grew up, my mother was Congregationalist, my father was Catholic. We grew up around both in a way. I didn't grow up in a world that hated Catholics in my small community, but others did. And my father said to me one day, he said that my mother's grandpa hated Catholics. He came out of a strict congregational. They didn't like Catholics. This was bad. Remember when JFK, we can't vote for JFK because he's going to be responsive to the Pope or something. I don't remember all those stories. But it was a real intense sort of anti-Catholic environment at both countries. But I went to Nepal, and many of the missionaries were from Northern Ireland in Nepal. And there was a big Catholic school and church, and they wouldn't do anything with that. They just had this real intense hatred. And you can think of other examples. We talk about Jackie Robinson, 42, and the color barrier. I didn't grow up in that world exactly. We're just rural farmers. We heard about that. We didn't have quite the racial tensions. We just didn't. I didn't grow up with it. So I didn't have attitudes. But you imagine growing up, you could be an 8-year-old kid and you'd be talking about those stupid Catholics or those stupid Protestants and they're going to go to hell and this and that. You could think, well, where did they get it? Those aren't solid self-beliefs. These are things they've heard from family and others, and they just spout them out. And a good example, here someone said, 2 years ago you were an epidemiologist, and now this month you're an expert, political science expert on East European, what? Because what happened? We had the epidemic, COVID, and now we have war with Ukraine. So people standing up, spouting their beliefs, and you think, are those really solid beliefs that you've formed long, slowly over time? Or are you just kind of hearing stuff from the news or this or that, and you're going to bring it out? And we get that in churches. I know I'm going through it. It's hard. But you'll hear people, you think, oh, Sister calls and she wants to talk about this, and you think, oh man, there's a lot of pseudo-self stuff just coming out. This pontificating, representing, bloviating sort of stuff. A lot of that is pseudo-self. Is that really who you are as a core person and what you really believe? So when the man says, I can't take the clarinet, well, it sure sounds like a lot of pseudo-self stuff to me. What do you really say? What do you really believe about worship and music? Step back for me and kind of explain where that came from, if you will. So we have to step back. Often when we get in conflict, we kind of move in that direction, and the pseudo-self kind of comes out. But this, I like of Jeannie, she's representing all the old family. She's going to save the church, and she's the expert and the authority, and a lot of that. Jeannie, what do you really believe and why? How do you move beyond it? So, pseudo-self beliefs are often adopted at times of major and lasting shifts in important relationships. So, I was supervising a young man who was down in the Dominican Republic teaching English for the sugarcane cutters of the Tay community, Haitian immigrants. And I said, let's go out for lunch, I'll take you out for lunch. He said, great. He said, but I'm vegetarian. I said, well, I don't care. I cook in the party. We were going out, and I said, how long have you been vegetarian? Second year of college? And I said, he said, yes, how did you know? I said, well, it usually takes about a year for the pressure to kick in. And he just laughed. But the idea was, you're a young man, you go to college, you don't know anyone, and you're anxious, and you want to fit into a group. Well, I'll be a vegetarian, I'll be with the progressive group, I'll be, you meet a group, they're kind of cool, and you like the kids. You realize, oh, okay, they're really careful about what they eat, they're careful about, riding a bike, and they're careful, oh man, I want to be, and pretty soon, next thing you know, you're vegetarian, because it takes about a year. And he kind of laughed. And it's kind of funny, I use it to illustrate, just to say he was studying environmental science, and he was concerned in simple living, and it was a long trajectory of his life, and it made sense just to kind of live more simply, and it sort of fit into a real solid self. But that's the pseudo-self idea. I can jump and change depending on beliefs that kind of up into that pseudo-self. All right, here's an example I'll do. This is on P8, and we'll close with lunch. So this is, we picked on Aaron a little bit, so this is picking on Peter. I apologize in advance. So Paul writes, when Cephas or Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned, for until certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles, but they came, and he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. So there's the anxiety component in there. So let's kind of draw it out here, if you will. So Peter, he used to eat with the Gentiles, so you get the red line. He's connecting there, but there's tension between the group from James with the Gentiles about their dietary habits, circumcision, and some other things, how they're keeping the Old Testament law. So when they come, first thing you know is they're anxious with Peter, like, Peter, what are you doing as a Jew, connecting and eating with the Gentiles in this way? So they're angry with him, so Peter's afraid. So Peter gets anxious. Then he cuts off the dotted line, shows the separation from the Gentiles. So he moves in that way, and then he connects back with that Jewish group, and so they're all fine, and then Paul comes in And Paul, of course, is the apostle to the Gentiles. So the double line there showing that. Paul hears the story that, what? Peter's doing what? So he gets angry with Peter, and then he says, you know, I opposed him to his face because he stood self-condemned, if you will. But that's that classic case of moving because of the relationships. So, oh, I believe this about food now, and then it's fine. Oh, they're angry, so I'm going to change my beliefs on food and move in and out of it. So that's kind of what it's illustrating. And then last thing here, this concept of solid self is rooted in the ability to really make a strong I statement, who you are and what you believe. And another term we use a lot in like philosophy, sociology, psychology, is just having agency, having a voice, able to state your voice, having a say, having a vote, if you will. So agency could be defined as the self-aware and reflective assertion by an individual of the intentional choice to make decisions affecting their life circumstances. In a sense, agency and the concept of self-determination are related, if not identical. So the ability to make decisions that affect your life, and you're not having decisions forced on you based on the group reaction around you, if you will. That sense of agency. And then finally, and this is a quote from Bush that puts it together, agency is not absolute, and Rowan is, that is, individuals' agency is usually limited by their environment and surrounding social structures. Nevertheless, they can still exercise a measure of agency within these limits. So it's cultural, it's situational, it's contextual, but still we have some sense of agency. So what do we really believe, why do we believe it, and what are the principles of those stuff? So, solid self, pseudo self. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm hearing bells. Any questions or comments? Sorry for throwing Peter under the bus there. We'll leave it on. Questions or comments before we move toward lunch? Yes, sir? Bam. So the statement that was made is that our music director often has alto notes that are too high. He needs to tone it down. Would you like to speak on behalf of the baritones?
Just to make everybody laugh, we were talking about dumb Christians and horrible Catholics last night. Before I was leaving to come here, I wanted to record some stuff on TV, so I was surfing. And I had no idea what he was talking about, but Dr. Phil was on as I was channel surfing, and he said, I dearly love our Lord. He said, it's Christians and Catholics that I hate.
But separating them out. I was just trying to give an example that you grow up with kind of racial tensions. You don't even know if you think about it. Like, when did you actually seriously form an opinion on this in some ways? I won't even, those who may not hear. Thank you for that. Yes. I love our Lord. It's kind of like Gandhi's comment. I love their, I can't remember the comment exactly. I can't think it. I'll think of it.
They said I like Jesus.
I like Jesus.
I love your Christ.
I like their Christ, but I haven't met a follower.
Unless your Christians don't act very much like him or
something like that. We don't quite have it, but that's. I would turn it, I don't know, do we sing for lunch? We're moving to that transition. Can you lead us in a song for lunch?
How about instructions first then?
That would come from others.
So, we'll sing in a second, but our deacons would like us to go down the hallway into the kitchen, or into Fellowship Hall, and not through the kitchen for lunch, right? Yeah,
Yes.
sorry, yes. That's the, and then Jay, how long will this lunch be for our Zoom friends?
It'll be 1 hour.
Okay, so we're gathering back here at 1 o'clock. So Tom, can you get us to sing?
Yeah, doxology.
Yeah, let's stand and sing the doxology.
Always have it. While Tom's doing that, Rich Laliberty online says, Gandhi via Google. I like your Christ, but not your Christianity.
You start with those tables and then just